The smoke curled like fingers around the mangled roofs of the village, choking the sky in a veil of gray. It had once been a place of laughter and drums, of goats bleating lazily in the sun and elders telling stories under the baobab. Now it was only ash and silence, broken by the occasional crackle of still burning wood. The king's soldiers had come like a summer plague, swift and merciless, their orders clear: erase the village, leave no seed behind. Nyoka had heard the screams first, distant like a bad dream. Then the heat came, the kind that scorched lungs and peeled bark from trees. Her mother had shoved her beneath the large grain pot, its base packed with dried leaves and stored millet. But when the fire reached their hut, her mother had done something Nyoka wouldn't understand until years later. She dragged the ashes from their hearth and with trembling hands, poured them over Nyoka, whispering, "You are the fire's daughter now. You must not cry." The pot was heavy. The ashes stung her eyes and filled her nose. She coughed once and stopped, clutching her knees in silence, listening as the roof above cracked and buckled, then fell inward. Her mother's body had not moved from the entrance. That was the last thing Nyoka saw through a slit in the pot's base, the glowing red of her mother's back, shielding her from the fire that licked around them. When morning came, the sun rose like a shy child over a graveyard. The wind scattered fine dust into the air, carrying with it the scent of scorched maize, burning hair, and something Nyoka could not name. She did not move until the second evening, when hunger gnawed louder than fear. She pushed the pot aside with weak hands and crawled out, her legs trembling, her throat raw. The village was gone. What had once been a ring of thatched roofs and stone fire pits was now blackened skeletons of wood, scattered bones, and the shriveled remains of dreams. Nyoka stepped carefully over the ashes, barefoot, every step a question she didn't want answered. The baobab tree at the center stood half-burnt, hollowed like a gourd. Beneath it, someone had tried to draw water from the earthen well before the fire found them. They now curled like a question mark beside the empty bucket. Nyoka found her mother's body half covered in soot, still facing the door. Her hands were outstretched as if she had died mid-prayer. Nyoka didn't cry. She lay beside her and whispered the song her mother had sung while grinding maize. "Child of dusk and child of flame, when the moon hides, say your name. If the world forgets your face, the fire will remember your place." The wind answered with a low moan through the charred bones of huts. She stayed 3 days in the village, drinking from puddles that formed in the cracked ground after a weak rain, eating whatever she could find unburnt, roots, a forgotten mango near the tree line. By the 4th day the silence became unbearable. The ghosts whispered at night. Sometimes she saw her cousin Tano walk past the ruins, dragging his broken leg. Sometimes she heard her grandmother's rattle. They were not alive, but the fire had not taken their voices. On the 5th morning she walked. She didn't know where the road led, only that it curved east, away from the blackened earth and toward something green. She passed abandoned outposts, fields left unharvested, and roads too quiet for a kingdom that once thrived on trade. Soldiers had taken more than just her village, they had taken the heart from the land. She saw burned wagons and broken spears left in haste. From travelers she hid. From sound she fled. 4 days she was only shadow and ash. It was a wandering priestess who finally found her near a stream, curled like a wounded bird beneath a fern. The woman wore white robes streaked with river clay, her face painted with ancient signs Nyoka didn't recognize. She said nothing at first, just handed Nyoka a gourd of water and watched her drink with trembling hands. "Whose child are you?" she asked gently. Nyoka hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know any more." The priestess looked at her long and deep, then said, "You smell of smoke. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that remembers." Nyoka didn't understand the words, but the woman took her in and named her Fireborn. For weeks, Nyoka followed her through villages that still stood, learning the way of silence, of healing, of listening to the wind. She helped wash wounds, ground herbs, and burned incense for the dead. But always her sleep was filled with ash and flame, with her mother's whisper in the dark. One night as they camped beneath a crescent moon, Nyoka finally asked, "Why would the king burn our village? We had no warriors. No gold." The priestess stared into the fire, her eyes glinting. "Because your village remembered something the king wanted forgotten. There is power in memory, and your people carried songs older than his crown." Nyoka sat silently, the answer like a thorn in her chest. Her mother's song echoed in her head again, stronger now. She hummed it softly, and the fire cracked in rhythm. That night, for the first time, she dreamed of a masked bride standing beside a golden throne, and behind her, the village burning again, but not with destruction. With light. The ash on Nyoka's skin never truly faded. Even as the seasons passed and her hands grew skilled with healing, even as she learned the sacred dances and the meaning behind every herb, the smell of soot lingered faintly in her breath. Others called it a curse. But the priestess said it was a memory branded into her spirit, a memory that could not be erased. You carry the past, she told Nyoka, and one day, it will bring you to the future that was stolen from you. And so, Nyoka waited. She watched. She grew. And beneath her quiet hands and ash-stained skin, something ancient stirred, something that remembered flames not just as destruction, but as rebirth. She arrived just before the monsoon, when the air hung heavy with the scent of wet soil and secrets. The villagers of Ka were used to visitors, traders, wanderers, warriors, but she was different. Clad in flowing brown robes stitched with faded threads and a veil of deep indigo that covered her face, she moved like smoke, seen yet never grasped. The only visible part of her was her eyes. And those eyes, sharp, calm, ancient, seemed to see far more than skin or sickness. She was called the healer with the mask. Children whispered about her in corners, daring one another to catch a glimpse beneath the cloth. Women sought her for remedies and whispered blessings. Men stood aside with a strange respect. No one dared ask her name, for the last time someone had, she simply looked at them with those moon-like eyes and said, "Names are for those who still live one life." She never slept in the village. She'd tend to the ill, stitch up wounds, whisper over fevers, and vanish by moonrise, setting up camp beneath trees or beside rivers, as if the walls of homes were too heavy for her soul. Her medicine was powerful, boiled barks, herbs ground by hand, powders that soothed pain, but it was her presence, not her potions, that lingered after she was gone. A presence that stirred something forgotten in the hearts of elders and made even the dogs go silent when she passed. No one noticed the scar, not until the boy with the broken arm. He had fallen from a tree, crying as his mother carried him to the healer's tent just outside the village. The healer didn't speak. She simply lifted the sleeve of her robe, revealing dark skin marred by a jagged scar running from her wrist to her elbow. The boy's tears stopped. Not because of the pain, but because of what he saw in her eyes when she touched him. Not pity. Not even concern. But memory. Like he reminded her of someone once held, once lost. That night, when the boy was healed and sleeping, the mother approached her, voice trembling. "Your scar, it looks like a burn." The healer only nodded, gently pulling her sleeve down. "But the royal army hasn't raided in years." "You." "I remember fire," the healer said, not looking at her. "And I remember running." "That is enough." The woman bowed her head and left. Rumors followed the healer like wind. Some said she was a fallen princess, cursed for loving a rebel. Others claimed she was no woman at all, but a spirit given form to walk among mortals until justice was done. But the truth lay somewhere quieter. Each night, the healer would sit alone, removing her veil in the dark, letting the cool air kiss the scar that crossed her cheek, running from jaw to temple like a question never answered. Her hand would tremble as it hovered over the locket she kept beneath her robes, an old, blackened piece of silver that once belonged to her mother. She remembered the flames, the screams, the smell of burning millet. She remembered hiding under the wooden slats, her mother covering her with her own body as soldiers kicked down the doors. The king's crest had been on their shields, the lion with the twin spears. She remembered the way they laughed. She remembered the fire catching on her mother's skirt. And she remembered being still, so still until the world turned to ash. Her name had been Nyoka. But Nyoka died in the fire. What remained was a woman with hands that healed, eyes that carried silence, and a mission that stretched far beyond healing wounds. She never asked for payment. Only stories. Wherever she went, she'd sit by the fire and ask the elders to speak of the old kings, of villages that once thrived, of songs that were now unsung. Some found it strange. But what she was piecing together wasn't just herbal knowledge, it was history. Names of generals. Dates of raids. Which roads the king's men had taken. Which commanders were honored. She asked not as a traveler but as someone building a map. Not of places but of truths long buried under fear. And while she helped the sick, her other work moved quietly in the background. A message sent here. A warning whispered there. She met with women who had lost children to conscription. With men whose sons never returned. With elders who still dreamed of the fire and woke up screaming. No one ever linked her to the burned village years ago. That place was long forgotten, cleared by royal decree, wiped from maps. The king had declared it a traitor's nest, and so its end had been righteous. But she remembered. And every time she bound a wound, she whispered her mother's name beneath her breath. Not as a prayer. but as a promise. One day word reached her that the king, now old and preparing for his final reign, was to be wed again. A new queen from a distant tribe, veiled and mysterious. A political match, they said. The entire capital was buzzing. That night the healer burned her herbs. She stared into the flames long and hard, letting the heat kiss the scar on her cheek. The same heat that had once tried to take everything from her. She packed nothing. Just the locket. And a single red veil. The road to the capital was long. But so was her memory. And the scar beneath the veil had not forgotten what the crown had done. The royal drums echoed through every valley and hill, stirring the dust of distant villages and silencing the morning birdsong. Messengers on horseback galloped from the capital with scrolls tied in silk, summoning all to gather by the royal plaza. It had been years since such a proclamation shook the bones of the kingdom. Rumors stirred like smoke. Was the king dying? Had a neighboring warlord declared vengeance? But when the golden parchment was nailed to wooden posts in every village, the words were simple yet shocking. The king shall wed. And not a noble woman but one of the people. Whispers ran like wildfire. A king marrying a commoner? The people, long bitter from war and ruin, were skeptical. Some thought it a trick, a ploy to quell unrest. Others believed it was guilt that drove him. For his hands were not clean. His conquest had left trails of blood and ash behind him. Many still mourned what he had taken. In one quiet village at the edge of the woods, a masked healer stood reading the announcement, her fingers tightening around her satchel of herbs. The wind lifted the veil across her face, but not enough to reveal the scars beneath. Her eyes, however, held stillness, not shock, not excitement. Only memory. She had heard of this king long before she knew his face. She had known him as the man whose soldiers brought fire to her childhood. The man whose symbol, a crowned hawk, was etched onto the blade that pierced her mother's heart. And now, that same man dared to stand before the kingdom and speak of love. Still she did not cry out. She simply folded the scroll into her satchel and walked back toward her hut, where herbs dried like hanging corpses from the beams. She tended a young boy with a fever, whispered ancient prayers and stared out the window as the sun dipped low. In the capital, preparations began. Banners were dyed, fountains scrubbed. Nobles scoffed behind closed doors, insulted that a peasant girl would one day sit upon the throne beside their aging king. But none dared speak against him publicly. His word was law. Then came the day of the choosing. The healer, Nyoka, was summoned by royal decree. A royal soldier, much younger than the men who had once burned her village, stood at her door with a velvet box and a scroll. He bowed low, not knowing who she truly was. "The king requests your presence at the palace," he said. "I'm no one," she replied, voice low and even. "You are known," he said gently. "Your hands have healed the dying. The people speak your name with reverence. The king wishes to meet the woman behind the mask." She almost laughed. The woman behind the mask? He hadn't known her then. And even now he still would not. Still she said nothing more. She took the scroll. That night she lit no candles. She packed nothing but a single braid of her mother's hair, kept sealed in an herb pouch. When dawn came, she mounted the waiting horse and rode in silence. The palace stood like a mountain of white stone, arrogant and tall, indifferent to the suffering it cast shadows upon. Nyoka was led through corridors lined with gold and guards. Her robes were plain, her mask still tightly bound across the lower half of her face. The king awaited her in the garden court, where jasmine bloomed too late in the season. He stood alone, his crown tilted slightly as if it weighed more now with age. His beard was streaked with gray, his eyes ringed with tiredness. He smiled upon seeing her. "You are not what I expected," he said. She bowed stiffly. "What did you expect, your majesty?" He chuckled softly. "A girl who'd tremble. Or flatter me. But you hold your silence like a sword." She said nothing. He stepped closer. "They say your hands are blessed. That you heal wounds no other can. I wonder, who healed yours?" Her eyes flickered. For a moment her breath caught in her throat. But she controlled it like always. Like her mother had taught her, moments before the fire came. "I learned to tend my own pain," she said. His smile faltered. He studied her face, his gaze trailing over the fabric that covered her mouth, her chin. Something stirred in him, but he could not place it. "I am an old man," he admitted. "I have ruled too long without kindness. I have made mistakes. I wish to give the people a queen who walks among them, who has bled as they have. I believe that queen is you." Nyoka's fingers clenched at her sides. The moment stretched like a thread ready to snap. "At last," she replied, If I accept your majesty, will it be love, or atonement? His face paled slightly. Perhaps both, he said, his voice lower now. Perhaps I hope love can erase old sins. She nodded once. Then you must learn this, your majesty, love cannot erase ash. It only grows from what we choose to plant in it. He did not understand her then. Not truly. But he nodded anyway, mistaking her answer for poetry. The wedding was set for the following full moon. Trumpets blared. The people, curious and bewildered, filled the streets with flowers and song. And at the center of it all stood a bride with a mask, a mystery wrapped in silence. But not even the king, as he watched her walk toward him beneath an archway of blood-red blossoms, knew that the girl he was about to marry was the very ash he once tried to bury. And the veil she wore was not for modesty. It was for vengeance. The palace walls buzzed with excitement. Word of the king's engagement to the masked healer had spread like wind-fed fire across the kingdom, igniting curiosity and celebration in equal measure. Banners of gold and red flapped in the breeze, musicians practiced love songs in the courtyard, and cooks prepared feasts that could feed 5 armies. But amid the joyful chaos, a strange unease crept like smoke into the corners of the palace. Nyoka entered the royal gates with neither fanfare nor fear. She walked beside the king, wrapped in a deep gray cloak, her face still hidden behind the veil she had worn for years. Only her eyes remained visible, calm, ancient eyes that seemed to see deeper than the flesh. The king, beaming with pride, held her hand as if it anchored him in a world that had long grown too heavy with regrets. He spoke of hope and rebirth, of a new chapter for the kingdom that would begin with their union. She said nothing, merely nodded once, the way a tree bends in a storm but does not break. Servants whispered behind carved pillars. Courtiers traded rumors like coins. She never speaks, they said. What is she hiding behind that veil? Others defended her, praising the way she'd healed the sick, tended to the wounded, and cured the queen's own niece with a tincture made from ash leaves. But the whispers never stopped, only softened when Nyoka entered the room, not out of respect but fear. There was something about her silence, the way it filled the air like the pause before a scream. In the gardens, animals gathered when she passed. Birds perched quietly on nearby branches, unmoving even as guards approached. Cats followed her at a distance, their tails flicking with curiosity. Even the palace dogs, usually rowdy and proud, lowered their heads and patted softly when she was near. The royal falcon, trained to attack on command, refused to fly when she lifted her gaze to the sky. The palace staff noticed it first, then the nobles, and finally the king himself. He chuckled nervously about it during a feast. Perhaps the gods have blessed her, he said, raising a goblet. But no one laughed. At night, Nyoka wandered the palace corridors without a lantern. Her footsteps made no sound on the marble. She studied the ancient tapestries of past rulers, her fingers sometimes grazing the woven depictions of war. One showed the burning of a village near the southern mountains, a scene of soldiers with torches, mothers fleeing with children, and a great cloud of smoke rising like a ghost. She stared at it for a long time, until a servant cleared her throat and offered to show her to her chambers. "Thank you," Nyoka said, her voice quiet and even. It was the first time any of them had heard her speak. The servant nearly dropped her candle. Preparations for the wedding continued. Priests arrived from distant provinces, each wanting to bless the union. The tailor made a gown of moon-colored silk and fire-touched gold. Jewels were brought from every corner of the land, yet Nyoka wore none. When asked what she preferred to wear on her wedding day, she replied, "Smoke cannot wear a crown." The dressmakers laughed, unsure if it was a joke or a warning. In the end, she accepted only a single ring carved from bone, one she had brought with her. The king grew more infatuated with her quiet presence. He visited her often, asking about her travels, the herbs she used, the lands she had seen. She offered short answers, sometimes none at all. But still, he listened, enchanted by her mystery. He told her of his youth, his victories, and, eventually, his regrets. One evening, as they walked in the garden, he confessed to her softly, "War has a cost. I did what I thought was right. But sometimes the ashes remain long after the fire dies." Nyoka looked at him then, and though her veil remained, the sorrow in her eyes was visible, sharp as broken glass. "The fire doesn't choose what it consumes," she replied. The king stopped walking. His face twitched, unsure of what to say. But then he smiled and nodded, taking it as poetry. He did not see the flicker in her hands, or how the moonlight reflected off a small burn mark beneath her sleeve. The night before the wedding, thunder rumbled without rain. The palace doors creaked though no wind blew. The head priest reported that his prayer candles had all gone out at once. In the eastern wing, a servant swore she saw a woman in ash-colored robes standing by the throne, only for the figure to vanish when she screamed. The king ordered the guards doubled. He blamed stress and superstition, but even he could not sleep that night. Nyoka stood in her room before a small mirror. She removed the veil and stared at her reflection. Her face bore the story of survival, smooth on one side, scarred on the other. Her lips were set in a line not of sadness but of resolve. Behind her, the air shimmered as if it remembered fire. She lit a small bundle of herbs and whispered to the flames in a language older than the kingdom. The smoke curled upward, dancing in spirals. From the shadows near her feet, a small black cat emerged, wrapping around her ankles, purring as though it had waited for this moment. When the bells rang to signal dawn, Nyoka dressed in silence. She wore no jewels. She wore no gold. Just gray, the color of memory, of ash, of the smoke that had once cloaked her escape. And as the palace awakened to celebrate the coming union, few noticed the sky darkening once again, the way old embers do when stirred too soon. The corridors of the palace began to breathe with unease. At first it was only the youngest maids who dared whisper. They spoke of dreams, strange, vivid dreams where the tapestries caught fire and laughter echoed from the walls like something had remembered joy only to twist it into something terrifying. They blamed the new bride, the masked queen-to-be, though none dared say it aloud near the guards or the queen-mother. Yet behind kitchen doors and beneath servant stairwells, they told stories with eyes wide and voices trembling. The queen-mother, seasoned by court intrigue and long shadows, watched Nyoka with growing wariness. Her son, the king, once a conqueror, now a man weary with age and regret, had grown oddly soft in the weeks since the engagement. He smiled more as if the silence of his bride soothed him, as if her presence melted some ancient guilt buried deep. The queen-mother saw it differently. She watched how birds perched on Nyoka's windowsill and refused to leave. She noticed how the wild hounds of the court, trained to attack intruders without command, now bowed their heads when Nyoka passed. One night, the queen-mother entered the sacred temple chamber with her personal priestess. The room was dim, lit only by firelight from hanging bronze lanterns. She knelt and asked the old gods for a vision. Instead of a divine answer, the flame flickered black and spat ash into her eyes. She gasped, stumbling back, clutching her chest. That night, she dreamed of her firstborn son, one long dead in a forgotten war, emerging from smoke, lips sewn shut, pointing toward the throne. She awoke shivering. The next morning she summoned her spies. She demanded to know who the masked woman truly was, where she had come from, and why not even the birds had reported her origins. They returned days later, pale and fearful, hands trembling as they laid burnt scrolls and twisted relics at her feet. No records, they said. No name. The villages she passed through all remember her, but none remember her arriving. The queen-mother summoned Nyoka to the East Hall that evening under the pretense of selecting wedding jewels. The vast chamber, lined with ancient armor and dusted velvet drapes, echoed with each step. Nyoka entered quietly, her hands folded, veil unmoved. The queen-mother studied her, trying to break her silence with long, calculating stares. "My son believes in love," the queen-mother said coolly. "But love is a soft gate through which enemies walk." Nyoka did not reply. "You do not speak. You do not laugh. You do not weep. What kingdom will my son marry into, I wonder, when you bring no name, no kin, and no past?" Still Nyoka stood unmoved. But her eyes, those ember-dark pools, flickered, only once, as if something ancient stirred behind them. The queen-mother dismissed her with a tight smile, but her heart now beat with dread. That night the dream spread. Guards woke screaming, their sheets scorched though no fire had been lit. A stable boy went mad, sobbing about horses with hollow eyes and a bride who walked barefoot through flames. And all throughout the night the walls whispered, not loudly, not clearly, but just enough to stir the hairs on the back of necks and the ghosts in one's memory. The king, oddly unaffected by it all, stood on the balcony watching the stars. "She's a miracle," he said to his most loyal steward. "Peace follows her. Even the air feels kinder." The steward hesitated. "My king, the servants speak of curses. Perhaps we must wait longer before the wedding." The king frowned. "They forget their own sins too easily. Let them feel fear. Let them dream. Perhaps they've forgotten what we've done." The steward bowed low, the words sticking to his tongue like soot. By the end of that week, the queen-mother had set a private ritual in motion. One meant to expose demons and unmask spirits. It required blood, just a drop, and the truth would rise like steam. She slipped a blade into her gown and invited Nyoka to a private prayer session in the moon hall, where silver shadows danced and secrets refused to hide. Nyoka arrived just before moonrise. The Queen Mother smiled graciously, handing her a sacred candle, and then reached to guide her hand. In that brief contact she let the blade slip. A shallow cut, a single drop of blood, fell to the sacred stones. The Queen Mother's breath halted. From the blood not steam but smoke rose. Thick black smoke. It curled like fingers around the Queen Mother's ankles. The moonlight vanished. The silver walls darkened to red. And from the smoke came a scent not of flowers, not of incense, but of charred wood and burning flesh. Nyoka lifted her candle. Her veil fluttered slightly, not revealing her face, but enough to show a scar just along her jawline, raw and crooked like melted wax. "You burned it all," Nyoka whispered. The first words she had spoken in the palace. The Queen Mother backed away trembling. "You." Nyoka's eyes gleamed through the shadows. "I remember your voice. It was you who gave the command." The Queen Mother collapsed against the altar, screaming for guards, but none came. Outside, the animals had all turned toward the moon hall. The palace itself held its breath. Inside, the whispers grew louder. And the Queen Mother was left alone with the smoke, the memory, and the veiled girl who had survived the ashes. Smoke curled above the lanterns of the night market, swaying gently like serpents in the breeze. Drummers beat slow rhythms, vendors called out spices and silks, and children darted between stalls with sticky fingers and glowing eyes. But at the edge of the market, where the lamps grew dim and the crowds thinned, an old blind woman sat with a bundle of bones in her lap. No one knew her name, only that she came on the nights when the moon was red and hung too close to the earth. She never begged. She never bought. She simply spoke. They gathered around her as they always did, drawn not by coin but by something far older. An ache in the ribs, a prickle at the nape of the neck, a whisper that told them tonight would not be like others. She began with a riddle. What walks in silence but leaves fire in its footprints? What carries ashes in its breath, but has never touched flame? The children giggled trying to guess. A ghost, said one. A dragon, said another. The blind woman only smiled, her sightless eyes fixed on something distant. No, she said. It is the girl who lived. That stilled them. She pulled a bone from her bundle, carved with lines like rivers. Long ago, a king sent fire to a peaceful village. He burned every roof, every root, every cradle. But beneath the ashes a child lived. She did not cry. She did not scream. She listened as the fire walked past her. She breathed in her mother's smoke. And in that smoke she was marked. Some scoffed. A tale for children, they said. But others leaned closer. She grew like a vine through cracks in stone. Hidden. Quiet. But she learned the names of herbs that could silence pain, and voices. She learned how to speak to birds, to snakes, to shadows. And she never forgot the name of the king who burned her. The woman's voice dropped, barely more than breath. One day she would wear a veil. Not for modesty. Not for mourning. But because behind it lived the memory of flame. And the king, thinking himself above the gods, would call her his bride. A chill passed through the circle. She would enter his palace not with knives, nor armies, nor spells, but with silence. And silence is the deadliest weapon of all. It fills the cracks in stone. It waits. And when it breaks, the echoes never stop. A man asked nervously, but why would she marry him? Why not strike him down? The blind woman tilted her head as if hearing the question from far away. Because vengeance is patient. It does not need to roar. It only needs to be seen. And on the night of her wedding, when the king believes he has conquered fate, she will remove her mask. And behind it, he will see not a face, but a truth. The market had gone still. Ash does not forget, she said, fingers tracing the air. And blood remembers the hand that spilled it. Someone whispered, this is just a story. The blind woman turned her face toward the palace. Then why does the king dream of burning halls? Why do dogs growl at the bride's door? Why do birds gather on her windows at night? No one answered. And then she laughed, a soft rustling sound like dead leaves. Do you think the veil hides her? No. It protects you. The crowd dispersed slowly, eyes wide, voices hushed. Children clung to their mothers. The drummers played faster now, as if to chase away the cold her tale had left behind. The next morning, the blind woman was gone. Only the bundle of bones remained in her place, and a single crow perched above, watching all who passed. Back in the palace, Nyoka sat before her mirror, still veiled. Her hands moved through her hair in slow, practiced motion. She did not smile nor weep. But in the glass behind her the flames danced, not from torches or candles, but from memory itself. And the king, waking from sleep, found the air thick with smoke though none had lit a fire. Somewhere in the hills the story was already taking root. The day of the royal wedding arrived with skies so still, even the clouds seemed to hold their breath. No birds sang. No breeze dared move through the trees. The castle, usually a symphony of clanging armor, bustling servants and laughter, now stood in reverent silence. Something unseen, something unspoken, hovered in the air. It wasn't anticipation. It wasn't joy. It was dread. The people had gathered from every corner of the kingdom, clothed in their brightest garb, but their faces bore the weight of a shadow they could not name. The streets, lined with petals and hung with garlands, looked like a painting waiting to come to life, but life had fled the scene. Mothers hushed their children without knowing why. Traders packed their goods earlier than usual. Even the dogs did not bark. Inside the palace, the king stood in his ceremonial robe of gold thread and wolf fur, his crown newly polished, his face stiff with age and uncertainty. He had spent decades ruling with a grip of steel, burning villages in the name of power, silencing dissent like one swats flies. But now, as he waited to take a bride he barely knew, the old man felt something he had not in years, the icy fingers of fear. Nyoka stood alone in her chamber, surrounded by silence thicker than velvet. Her dress was simple but impossibly elegant, black and silver, stitched with thread made from crow feathers and ash-dyed silk. The veil covered her face entirely, save for her haunting eyes that never blinked too long, never looked away too soon. When the servants came to lead her to the ceremonial hall, none dared speak to her. They simply bowed, afraid to look too long into those eyes that seemed to carry storms. She walked slowly, deliberately. Her bare feet patted against the cold stone, and every step echoed louder than a drum. Each tap was like a heartbeat in a tomb. Those who saw her pass bowed low, not in reverence but in the kind of fear given to omens and warnings. The palace musicians, dressed in white, raised their flutes and strings as tradition commanded, but no sound emerged. Their hands trembled. Their mouths dried. One by one they lowered their instruments, unable to force a single note through the tight grip of something neither man nor magic could name. The great hall remained voiceless. Even the wind outside refused to press against the stained glass windows. At the altar, the king watched her approach. His chest tightened with each of her footfalls. He remembered burning a village long ago, its name escaped him now. He remembered the cries, the smoke, the woman who screamed while cradling a child's body wrapped in cloth. She had cursed him with her final breath. He had laughed back then. But now, watching this veiled figure move like smoke and silence incarnate, he wondered if curses aged with their casters, or if they merely waited. She reached him and stood still. She did not bow. She did not kneel. She stood like a queen made not of birthright or blessing, but of ruin and fire. Her hands were folded in front of her, her veil untouched. She had not spoken a word since she arrived at the palace weeks ago. The court had whispered endlessly. Was she mute? Was she a witch? A saint? Some said she had healed a dying child in seconds. Others said they saw a raven speak to her. The priest began the rites, voice shaky, words faltering. He asked for vows, for gestures of union. Nyoka gave none. Still, the king moved forward, his hand trembling as he reached for her veil. He paused. Then, with fingers that had signed death orders, had burned cities, had seized crowns from trembling nobles, he pulled the fabric back. Gasps tore through the room like a plague wind. Her face was beautiful, terribly so. Not in symmetry or softness but in truth. One side was flawless, glowing with calm. The other, burned. Twisted. Scarred so deeply the flesh still looked red despite the years. Her hair was long and black, but patches of it were thin, some strands white like snow. And her eyes, one held sorrow and the other held fire. The king stepped back. He remembered her now. A child buried beneath ash. Her face peering up at him through smoke as soldiers dragged her mother's body away. She had lived. He had known, had ordered the soldiers to leave no one alive. But one must have disobeyed. Or maybe the fire had spared her on purpose. Nyoka said nothing. But her presence said enough. The people stared, not with horror but with understanding. The veil had been a mercy, not for her but for them. They couldn't have looked her in the face and celebrated. They couldn't have clapped and danced and cheered while the ghosts of her past stared them down through her silent eyes. The queen mother fainted. A guard vomited quietly in a corner. The priest forgot his lines and stepped backward until he hit the wall. Nyoka remained still. Then, without command or gesture, the great hall's torches flickered. One by one they died out. The only light left was from the windows, and even the sun seemed dimmed by her truth. Still she did not run. Did not cry. She merely turned to face the court, allowing them all to see. One by one they lowered their eyes. Some began to weep. The king tried to speak but found no words. He looked smaller than ever before, his once grand robes hanging like guilt upon his shoulders. Nyoka raised her hand slightly, and though it was not a threat, he recoiled. She finally opened her mouth. One word. Just one. Remember. Her voice was like wind through burnt trees, soft but carrying through every soul in the room. The king fell to his knees. She stepped back from the altar and walked down the aisle she had entered moments ago. The musicians still could not play. The guards did not move. The nobles parted like smoke before her. Outside the sky broke. Thunder cracked, though no storm followed. Birds returned but they did not sing, they watched. And Nyoka, the bride of smoke and silence, disappeared beyond the palace walls, leaving behind a veil, a scar, and a kingdom forever changed. The throne remained but its seat was cold. And in the absence of music, a tale had begun. The chamber was deathly silent as the scarred girl stood before the man who had ordered her world turned to ash. The golden candlelight flickered along the walls, dancing like the flames that once consumed her village. Nyoka stood still, her veil now resting in a heap beside her. The king's eyes, once so sure of their power, faltered. She stepped closer, slowly, not like a predator nor a bride, but like truth walking into a lie. The train of her wedding gown whispered against the marble floor, the sound more haunting than any battle cry. She held no blade, no vial of poison, no magic talisman, only her voice which until now had been silent. "I remember your banners," she said softly. Her voice, when it finally came, sounded like it had been dragged through smoke and stone. "Red like the roofs of my village just before they collapsed." The king opened his mouth but no sound came. He looked older than he had just hours ago. The celebration had made him feel youthful, vibrant, adored. But now, as he stared at the face of the girl who had survived his fire, time caught up with him like a weight he could no longer carry. "I was 6, Nyoka continued. "My mother covered me in ashes to keep me from being seen. I watched from beneath her ribs as your men dragged my cousin by her hair. I saw a soldier toss a baby into a cooking fire. I watched your orders play out like a song of ruin." He looked down, his fingers trembling as they touched the edge of the throne. She walked closer, her eyes never blinking. "You forgot us. You called it justice. You called it tribute to your reign. But I remember every crackling flame. Every scream that echoed off the hills." Still, she carried nothing in her hands. No judgment written in steel. No curse chanted from an ancient tongue. Just her presence, alive, scarred, and unafraid. "I didn't come here to kill you," she said. "If I had, you'd already be gone. I came to give you a choice." The king's voice cracked when he finally found it. "What choice?" Nyoka knelt, her hands resting lightly on her knees, the wedding gown pooling around her like mist. "Confess. Admit what you did. Speak the truth to your people. Or remain silent, and let the curse follow your name to your grave." He stared at her as if she were a ghost, as if his past had bled into his present and taken human form. The weight of his crown grew unbearable. He could hear distant echoes, his own voice from years ago shouting orders, laughter from soldiers, crackling fires, a child's scream. "I was a different man," he whispered. "No," she replied. "You were always this man. Tonight you decide if you'll remain one." A wind moved through the chamber, though no windows were open. It brushed her hair back gently as if the spirits of the dead had gathered to watch. The torches dimmed slightly as though even the flame paused to listen. The king lowered his head. His hands gripped the arms of his throne, and the silence that followed stretched like a judgment in itself. Nyoka remained kneeling, the ashes of the past behind her, the future waiting to be rewritten. The choice was his, but the reckoning had already begun. The king stood before his people, not on a gilded platform but in the center of the palace courtyard where the stones were still warm from the day's heat. The crowd had gathered in murmuring confusion, summoned at twilight by the sound of the palace bell, a sound usually reserved for war, death, or declaration. Tonight it told for something stranger. His robes were wrinkled, his crown slightly askew. The grandeur of royalty clung to him like an ill-fitting costume. At his side stood Nyoka, veiled once more, though everyone had heard by now, rumors as swift as wind, of the scarred girl behind the mask and what had passed in the chamber. He raised his hand. Silence spread like a tide. "I have wronged this land," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "Decades ago I ordered the burning of a village. I claimed it as justice. I called it punishment. But it was cruelty. I destroyed lives. And I buried the truth beneath years of gold, parades, and silence." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by stunned stillness. No one interrupted him. "I married a woman last night. A woman who survived that fire. She came not for vengeance but for truth. She showed me what kind of man I had become, and what I still had a chance to be." He reached up and removed the crown from his head. For a moment, it gleamed in the dusk light, but then before all eyes the gold blackened. A shadow passed over it as if the crown itself rejected his hands. "I am no longer worthy to rule," he said. "Let the throne be empty until someone pure of heart dares to sit upon it, not with blood but with mercy." With slow steps he placed the crown on the palace steps and stepped back. Nyoka said nothing. She did not take the throne. She only looked once toward the people and then turned. She walked away barefoot, her veil fluttering behind her like smoke. The guards did not stop her. The nobles parted without a word. Children watched her go with wide eyes, and the wind carried ash-scented air through the square. They say when the moon is low and the wind carries the scent of wood smoke through the hills, the elders gather by the fire, their eyes turn not to the stars, but to the flickering embers below. There, beneath cracked lips and wrinkled skin, stories bloom like coals catching flame. And among those tales, none is more quietly revered, or cautiously repeated, than the story of the bride who wore fire on her face. They say her name was Nyoka, though few dared speak it loudly. Not out of fear, but out of reverence, as one might whisper the name of a storm that once passed through but left the land greener after it went. Children lean in closer when the elders begin, not because they hope for horror, but because something in them wants to understand how pain can transform without becoming vengeance. It begins always with fire. A village once stood among the trees, quiet and full of laughter. It was not rich nor important to maps drawn by kings. But it had songs. It had harvest dances, and it had mothers who told stories while braiding their daughters' hair. It had Nyoka, a child like any other, barefoot, stubborn, full of mischief. Until the soldiers came. Until the fire fell like judgment. They say Nyoka should not have survived. That she did not scream when her skin burned because her mother's arms had wrapped around her, sheltering her with a final, desperate love. When dawn rose, she crawled from the ash, not a child but something else. Not yet a ghost, not yet a girl. From there, her story vanishes into mist. Some say she was taken in by forest folk. Others speak of a temple hidden in the cliffs, where healers teach the art of mending without poison or blade. But what is known is that she returned years later, not to reclaim what was lost but to walk among the broken. She became the masked healer, the silent one with eyes like river stone and hands that stitched flesh and soul alike. Villages whispered about her presence long after she'd moved on. Mothers left offerings by the trees, hoping she would return when their children fell ill. And all the while she carried her silence like a second veil, hiding not just her face but her memory. Until the king announced he would marry a commoner. Until his eyes fell upon her. No one truly knows what passed through her mind when she accepted the proposal. Some say she did it for revenge. Others believe she had seen his death in a dream and wanted to meet it head-on. But those who understand her best say this: she accepted not to strike, but to show him a mirror no one else could offer. And so she walked the palace halls like a shadow dressed in silk. The servants felt her presence before she entered a room. The queen mother whispered of her stillness, of how animals watched her with knowing eyes. The walls whispered too. Of dreams filled with fire. Of footsteps echoing long after she was gone. The palace, once filled with laughter and music, grew hushed in her presence. Not because she demanded it, but because something ancient followed her. Then came the wedding. They say no birds sang that morning. That even the bells sounded hollow. She walked the aisle alone, veil untouched, steps like thunder. The king smiled but his eyes did not. And when night fell and they were alone in the royal chamber, she removed her veil. And he saw. Not just the scarred face, half melted, half healed, but the eyes of the child he had left screaming in the blaze. He saw the reflection of his own sins, etched not in words, but in the skin of the woman before him. But she did not strike him. She did not curse him. She knelt. And she told him in the quietest voice he had ever heard what he had done. Not with rage but with memory. Not to accuse, but to offer a choice. Confess, she said, or let the curse continue. And the king, trembling, bowed his head. The next day before his people he confessed. He removed his crown. It blackened in his hands. And Nyoka, the bride of Ash, walked away, leaving the throne behind. She did not seek power. She never returned to the palace. Some say she went back to the forest, where fire had once tried to end her. Others believe she vanished into the hills, becoming legend. But the elders, those who still remember the heat of that long-ago fire, say they've seen her. Sitting beside village wells in the early hours, teaching little girls how to grind herbs for medicine. They say she speaks rarely, but when she does, her voice carries the weight of mountains and the gentleness of rain. And when children ask if her story is true, if a girl burned by kings can rise and walk without hatred, the elders nod, slowly. They tell them, it was never about revenge. It was never about the crown. It was about remembering. Because when truth is forgotten, the fires return. They add wood to the flame. They sip from their cups. And sometimes, just before the wind picks up again, they swear they see her. A shape in the smoke, a whisper in the dark. The story, they say, still walks. Not as a warning but as a promise, that even those who are scarred can become healers. That even the ashes of the past can grow gardens if left in the hands of one who remembers without hate. And that mercy, though silent, echoes louder than fire ever could.